right, we're setting up. We're going live. I'm seeing the progress bar, so as soon as we're live, we can get started.
Okay.
All right. So, hello, Facebook world. I hope you can all hear us and see us. We are live here, and I'm here with Dr. George from History Miami, and we're very excited to introduce him and get to some questions that we have about Florida history, pandemics, what's happening now, and where it came from, what the precedent is. So we're just going to give people a few minutes to join in. And if you like, feel free to drop in the chat where you're listening in from, any questions that you might have. And I even have an activity for you. While we're waiting for a few more people to join, you can go to mywishforus.com. And there you can share your wish, your vision for the future of America, for the future of the United States. We're collecting wishes from all over the country, and we're asking people to share their vision so that we can understand what the nation's talking about right now. What do you care about? And that's going to inform all of our work. So we appreciate all of you tuning in right now. I'm changing my view so that you can all see Dr. George as well. And we'll get started in just another minute. So thanks for tuning in. If you're just joining us, this is a Facebook Live between Made by Us and History Miami. So we're excited to be streaming to you from 2 Facebook pages. History Miami is an outstanding history museum and institution in, of course, Miami, Florida. And Made by Us, if you're not familiar with what we do, we are essentially an engine bringing together the nation's history institutions and civic engagement organizations to connect with millennials and Gen Z and share history in new ways. So if you're a young person today or a person of any age, check out what we're doing at historymadebyus.org. And the best way to stay up to date with what we're doing would be to follow us on social media at History Made by Us, which if you're watching this on Facebook, you probably can get there very easily, or to sign up for our newsletter. And that would be something you can do at historymadebyus.org. So we're just going to give people maybe one more minute to join, and we'll jump in. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. George today. I have actually been spending this quarantine period in Miami, even though I'm not from Miami, and I actually knew very little about it before coming there. So I'm really excited. I have, quite frankly, loads of questions for you today. So we'll get into those. And then the one more thing I'll mention before we get started is Made by Us has just posted another fun activity on our social media channels, which is a historic recipe challenge. So if you are watching this and you have recipes in your family, your community, things that, or even your favorite foods that make you wonder, where did this come from? I mean, who came up with this dish? Dig in, learn some of the history behind it, through Google or your local historical society. Share with us in the comments. We want to know the stuff you're finding. I will say I personally got on a rabbit hole a few weeks ago on Sloppy Joes. Why are they named that? Where did they come from? What a crazy sandwich that we keep referring to, and everyone knows what it is, but where did that come from? So, and there's quite a history. Actually, there's a history that involves South Florida, I believe. So we'll have to see if we get to the food portion of our segment. Okay, without further ado, we have people listening in. I'm sure you're all eager to hear from Dr. George. So I wanted to introduce Dr. George. He is a historian. He is the lead historian at History Miami, but he also teaches, he writes books. He's the foremost expert that I've met on Florida history. So we're excited to have him here today. And one thing we asked Dr. George to do before this was to share his wish for the future of the United States. So as I've said, we are capturing these visions for the country at mywishforus.org. And there are so many there. You can explore them. You can go state by state. You can pull up a word cloud and see what people are saying. Dr. George gave us a really powerful wish. I love to hear from historians because you have this expansive view of the past. You know that what we're going through now is just one small season, but it's connected to what happened before and definitely to what's going to come in the future, what happens next. So Dr. George's wish, we will share this in the comments, but he has asked that we lower our voices and listen more closely to each other to help one another and appreciate and respect the unique freedoms we as Americans possess. So that is a really fantastic wish. I think it's something we can all agree is needed. And when I think about respecting the unique freedoms that we as Americans possess, it strikes me as something that is so Florida, because America is a very unique country, and within that, Florida is a very unique state. So we're excited to learn more from you today, Dr. George. So I guess just to get started, is there anything, let's hear from you, how did your family come to be in South Florida? How long have you been in Miami? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's interesting, just like so many people who arrived in Miami and South Florida, my family came, I think, looking for new opportunities. My mother's family came down and settled in a place called Lemon City, which is part of today's city of Miami. It was an old homesteading community. They came down in the late 30s, Depression era, gypsies, looking for opportunities after my grandfather had, his business had dried up. And so they did this long journey from Philadelphia to Chicago, where they had family and friends, to a tiny little town in northern Florida called Sneads, the proverbial one-stop light, to Miami, Lemon City. And several of them, including my mom, just fell in love with Miami. Its subtropical ambiance, the nearby water, the weather, just everything about it. And so this was in the late 30s, and my mother got married in the 40s to my father. She had known him back when they were both youths, and they reconnected, got married in Philadelphia, lived there for a while, then came down to Miami. Then my brother and sister and myself were born, and we grew up here. And I finished undergraduate school, high school and undergraduate school here, then went off to Florida State University for my master's and PhD, and came back here in the 80s and had been really busy as an historian for the last almost 40 years in this area. And I've had the good fortune of just focusing on Miami, South Florida, and Florida history as my major areas of historical endeavor. I'm one of the lucky guys that had that magical high school teacher, in this case, in American history. I was a mediocre student, but the way he taught American history just gave me such an interest in it. And I just kind of took it from there. And, I flew with it, and I'm still flying with it.
That's so great. I mean, I think for many of us, that one teacher makes all the difference. So shout out to all the great history teachers out there for helping create the historians we have today, and just the citizens we have among us today. So I know the question on everyone's mind is about, looking at the news, and we see Florida in the news again. There was a big spike, although I think COVID cases have actually declined now. Mm-hmm. What is the historical precedent for this? How did Florida deal with a pandemic in the past? I mean, what was it like? I mean, I don't know if the 1918 story comes to mind, or were there other pandemics that we could draw lessons from?
Well, there have been several medical challenges, one of which was, and I wouldn't put it at the pandemic level because it didn't engage such a huge population, was yellow fever. And we see yellow fever as early as the 1600s in St. Augustine. And then we see it again in the late 19th century in places like Key West and Jacksonville. And then in 1899 in Miami, which was a brand new city at the time. And the way they dealt with it in many of those places was they shut things down and they sort of closed the city down. In the case of Miami in 1899, from middle of October until the middle of January 1900, it was closed to people coming in and out. And eventually it dissipated. So it was a serious health challenge. Jacksonville had horrendous problems. I mean, they had a fair percentage of people who were affected by it. We had in Miami's population in 1900 was 1,681, according to U.S. Census, and about 88 or so people were hit with it, and about 14 died from yellow fever. So that's one thing. But also another problem we had, and I wouldn't put it at the pandemic level, but more of the epidemic level, was typhoid. And we find typhoid, which comes from infected food and water with terrible, chronic dysentery and things like that, diarrhea problems. We find that in these military camps in Tampa, preparing men to go off to fight in the Spanish-American War in 1898, where they had over 300 cases of typhoid, and it can lead to dehydration. It can really put you under. Miami had a similar problem. We had a camp down here called Camp Miami, and we had scores of typhoid cases also, with a lot of sick people. More people actually died on the American side in that war from disease than died from bullets and other military action. But then, of course, we've got the 1918 pandemic. It's worldwide. There have been some really noteworthy books written on in the last 15 years. The estimate is, pretty good estimates, between 50 and 100 million people succumbed to it. If you took those figures and put them against today's population, you're talking about maybe 300 million people worldwide. In the United States, about 670,000. And Miami, they really didn't finish counting it. They had like 87 by late October of 1918, which was the worst month in the pandemic. It was transmitted in many ways by military personnel. We went to war in 1917 as part of World War I. And in these camps in Kansas, in the Boston area, you begin to see it spreading by the spring of 1918. And then you see it a little bit subdued in the summer, and then it just rages in October, which was the most lethal month. And then it kind of dissipates. In the case of Miami, it really dissipates significantly after that. But let me give you some Florida statistics that's really, really interesting. In 1918, the average life expectancy of an American was 50. It dropped down in 1918 to 39. And then it bounced up again in 1919 when this pandemic was largely over, back to 50. So that shows you the impact of this thing. And again, it really is. And of course, we didn't have the medicines or the knowledge or the understanding of it. You know, we believed it was a virus. We really had no way to check this out. We didn't have testing of that nature. So the usual antidote was that you got to get a lot of rest, get a little bit of sunshine, drink warm lemonade, take quinine, gargle a couple times a day with hot salt water. And that was about it. And then if things continued, maybe you take a mild laxative. So the approach was so different. You know, we just didn't have the knowledge 102 years ago as we do today to deal with this. But the beauty of that was, Caroline, that pandemic came and went. Even though, again, there were some activities in 1919 and even in some places in 1920, by and large, for the most part, it was over by the latter part of 1918. Okay. We're now into the 5th, 6th month of this in America, and we see where it's raging at this time. So we believe, unfortunately, that, you know, the end is probably not near for this pandemic. Now, I want to tell you something else that's interesting too. So that's the pandemic in 1918. I want to throw in something else. Many of the pandemics and the epidemics begin in continents that include China and different parts of Africa, south of the Sahara Desert. There was a pandemic that began in China in the mid-1800s that spread to India that resulted in the loss, according to the best historical estimates, of 6 million people, primarily in India. Wow. But see, it was more confined, though, to those two areas. Right. Whereas this is, as was the 1918 thing, this is worldwide. Right. Because we travel much easier now. In 1918, soldiers were here and there and everywhere. So, you know, these are different elements of it that set it apart from other earlier ones.
Well, I think about that with Miami too, because it is a big port city and it's a big travel hub and it's a big international travel hub. Right. And, you know, I think that's something that not every part of the country has to also grapple with. I mean, the tourism, we can talk about the tourism impacts and things, but it sounds like what you're saying is, even though we don't know how to handle all of the aspects of this right now, they were even guessing more back then. I mean, disease was just part of life more than it is now. Was that the case?
They were guessing more, a lot more then. And one of their antidotes also to it was isolation, even something called pest houses, where they would, listen to this, unwisely confine you with other people into a finite structure, you know, which doesn't really bode well for anybody in that structure. Right. But to sort of segregate you from the general population. And again, on the other side, though, Caroline, what's so fascinating is the precautions you could take then and that were suggested, enforced by law, were very similar to today's.
Really?
Masking, staying away from large crowds, um, uh, making sure that your masks fit a certain standard,
Sure.
to keep out. So they understood part of that, which was
Yeah.
interesting. Quarantining cities, um, curfews at nighttime,
Wow.
uh, partial shutdowns of cities, and
And
of course the lament.
how easy was that to enforce? I mean, what was the
It,
density
it
of
was
population
it was
density?
difficult. It was
Okay.
difficult. There were a lot of libertarian leaning people. America's always been a land of freedom, and we had that mentality. Government shouldn't be doing these things to us. Same sorts of things. And there was even an anti-masking league that arose. San
Hmm.
Francisco had 4,000 members of an anti-masking league. San Francisco's government was one of the hard-nosed governments when it came to imposing quarantines, masks, et cetera, et cetera. So we tried a lot of the same precautions that we're trying today, which is kind of fascinating. And there's lots of photographs around of people who are masked
Mhm.
in 1918 in particular.
Wow. I mean, it's so interesting. It feels like some of the things you're saying we could be talking about today, really.
Right. Mhm.
And so just to go back to, because one of the things that fascinates me about Florida, I said earlier, I'm new to Florida, but I am very enthusiastic. I have been quarantining there for the past few months, and in the Miami area. And the population of Florida was so small for so long, and now it's the third most populous state. Did
Yes.
that play a role in how people dealt with pandemics? Just the number of people? Like, when did that change to have an impact?
Well, yeah, and that's a great question. Yes, Florida on the eve of World War II, in other
Uh-huh.
words, the 1940 census had less than 2 million people. And the great growth that you're inquiring about takes place with and after the war. And in the words of Damon Runyon, a lot of people came down for basic training. We had a lot of camps all over. Miami had a camp, Fort Lauderdale had a camp, other parts of Greater Miami had military camps. Jacksonville had a huge naval facility there. Tampa had a huge facility. In the words of Damon Runyon, especially as it pertains to South Florida, a lot of the men and women that came down here who took basic training as well as technical training got sand in their shoes and returned to the area after World War II.
Okay.
And so you begin to see this soaring population.
Mhm.
And that population has brought us to today where we're in excess of 21 million people. As you said, the third largest state in the United States. So it's just been an enormous spurt, a population spurt.
Oh, definitely.
Um,
It must play a role. We have a question from Juan. Do you see a similarity between the mortality rates of 1918 and the 2020 pandemics in Miami?
well, the mortality rates in some parts of Florida were judged to be at something at 2% plus, and we're seeing mortality rates that's somewhat below that in some of these areas that we're talking about now. I know the infection rate has gone up, and now I think it's starting to come down, say, in Miami-Dade County where we are. And that infection rate was way up, but that's not necessarily the mortality rate. It's somewhere hovering around 1% or 1% plus.
Mm.
So I think it's a little bit lower than it was for the pandemic in 1918. But when you think about it, it's marvelous that the pandemic mortality rate wasn't worse than it was, since we had such little information about the cause and the treatment
Yeah.
of this virus.
Yeah, I mean, it really, at the beginning of this, I have to say, it gave me a lot of empathy for people in history who went through difficult situations. And sometimes it's this privilege of the present. You can think, why didn't they leave? Or why didn't everyone just stay home? Or, when you think about war, why didn't you all just flee, or a hurricane or some natural disaster? But when you're living through it, it doesn't happen that way. Information doesn't come the way you need it to all the time. And everyone's just making their best guess, it seems like.
Well,
So,
it's true. And also, even after they've become aware of it, there's so many encumbrances that would keep you here, family, perhaps work, just sort of safeguarding your home and your property. So, there's so many extenuating circumstances to it.
yeah. I wanted to go back to something you said about the pest house. It sounds like
Right.
if you were being sent to the pest house, that was bad news. So what were it sounds like that was one of the treatments available. What were some of the other treatments available, or are there any surprising stories about how doctors handled the pandemic? I mean, what was the expectation for medical professionals at that time?
Well, in many ways, they looked at previous epidemics and what have you, and just kind of proceeded on that basis. As we mentioned before, if it was a high fever, you try to bring it down. If you had throat problems, you gargle with salt water. Things that today, pre-antibiotic and everything else, would seem very primitive in terms of treatment. And so they were leaning on the old treatment. We did have various county health boards, not just in Miami, but all over the place. And that's really a phenomenon that comes in the 19th century. And it's good because now the physicians that head that and the people that work with them, their major job is dealing with things like pandemics and health epidemics. So you do have that. So they were really focused on it. Our hospitals filled. We only had one major hospital in Miami. The African-American community had no hospitals.
Wow.
And the lone black millionaire in what was called Colored Town, the segregated black neighborhood, today's Overtown of Miami, the lone black millionaire, D.A. Dorsey, donated a building of his for an impromptu makeshift hospital for the black community. And later, a hotel was converted into a hospital for the black community. Those hospitals are just overflowing. What the doctors did was, you had hospital attendants who actually lived on campus. They were forced to leave the hospitals because they filled those bays and those beds that had housed the attendants, and they ended up camping outside. Plus, they actually put up tents outside where some of the patients were treated. So, it kind of came out of left field, and we had a scramble. We didn't really have a plan for it at all. Just like this thing kind of caught us in many ways by surprise too.
Yeah, it sounds like even some of, the inequities that were there then that were maybe even more structural in nature that we're seeing now, I mean, they have a history. Disease and public health does not affect everyone equally. And what we're seeing now with even things like people who are immunocompromised and people who have just a different situation, people who have to go to work, essential workers, how much could people, I'm just so curious, and then we're going to get to some user questions.
Sure.
But I have so many questions about this. In 1918 in Miami, how possible was it to stay home? Did people just have to go work?
Well, here's what happened. And again, this is another one of the precautions they took that's similar today. Closed movie theaters, restricted hours in factories, shut down churches and other places of worship, shut down schools. But it was so short-lived compared to today. We're talking about the month of October in greater Miami. And then this is interesting because our health department says by October 6th, hey, we got a full-blown health crisis. By Halloween night, trick-or-treat's going on. By November 11th, Armistice Day Parade is taking place in downtown Miami. So things have returned to some kind of normality. Right. So, things kind of happened very, very quickly there. And then they came back to normal. It was an interesting situation.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, the economy stuff alone, I'm conscious that Florida's economy is, I would think, heavily based on tourism. You can tell me more about that, but that has to be something that's affected now, and it would have been affected in the past by disease, I'm sure.
It was, and terribly affected by it today, and to a lesser degree before. But getting back to your earlier question, people did complain. I've got to work. I can't stay home, but you can't teach. The schools are closed, and there wasn't any online teaching, obviously, at that time. But they were shut down for probably a month at the most. So that's a little bit different. The only thing allowed to remain open were food stores and pharmacies. That was it. But again, this is just a few weeks. But getting back to today, I mean, we're just heavily dependent on tourism. There is just zillions of people. And I want to give you a sneak preview of a health challenge we had 4 years ago from the Zika, from the mosquito.
Yeah.
And that was in Wynwood, one of the most heavily visited tourist spots in Miami. It's an old neighborhood that's been gentrified. It's the wall art capital of the United States, if not the Western world. I mean, it's fantastic. Since you've been here for a while, you obviously have heard about it. Yeah. And hopefully one day when things return to normal, you'll be able to see it. I mean, everything's plastered with great art, great graffiti art. Anyway, Zika hit there. And it was a very small area. It was like equivalent of a couple blocks. But it closed businesses, and tourism dropped dramatically for a period of part of the summer of 2016. Then there was a little bit of revival in 2017. It deals in hot weather, rainy environments. You had to tip over any type of receptacles that were collecting water, and people sort of stayed away from the place. But then everything returned to normality. But it gave us, unbeknownst to us at the time, a sneak preview of how damaging a health crisis could be. In this case, to a particular neighborhood that was really thriving on tourism. So, we saw that today, cruise ships are shut down. We welcomed in and out of Miami a year or two ago 5.8 million cruise ship passengers. You can imagine the business that came out of that. This was the cruise ship capital of the world, followed by Port Everglades and Fort Lauderdale. So I mean, it's massive what happened here. So tourist restaurants have closed, bars have closed. There is some outdoor dining, but bars again have been closed. We opened perhaps too early. I certainly believe we did when we began to lift the covers in April, May. And so we've come back to closing a lot of these places. I think we've had pretty good local leadership here. I frankly do. I really do. I can't say the same for other levels of government. For certainly the local level, they've been pretty much attending to it. Of course, we have a mayor of Miami, a great guy, Francis Suarez, who was one of the early noted infectious cases of this virus, going back to, I believe, the early to middle part of March. And fortunately, he fared okay.
Yeah.
But so we saw it firsthand among our leadership.
Yeah, I mean, you hope that never has to happen for this to be taken seriously. And actually, this goes to a question from one of our viewers, Angela. Did the community take the Spanish flu seriously, or did anyone think it was a hoax?
Great question. It took a lot of convincing. In other words, you begin to hear buzzes in early October. Hey, people are getting sick, and it's in a widespread way. Something's going on here. This is not the normal early winter or mid-fall cold. And it's interesting because one of the health directors of Miami was quoted in the Miami Herald on October 5th saying, there's nothing to worry about. The next day, it's announced that we're in what today we would call a pandemic. So that's how quickly it shifted. So a lot of people, I think, just were kind of blasé about it, and suddenly they began to get more serious, especially when within a few days, schools were closed, houses of worship were closed, theaters were closed, parks were closed. Then they understood that, there was some gravity to this situation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can see as we're living through this, it happens fast. I mean, I can remember in February using the term pandemic. I mean, it feels insensitive to say now, but I was almost using it like like how we say World War III or the apocalypse. And it's something that we don't think can happen again, but
right.
Here we are living through history.
Well, our economy was booming, and we just got waylaid. It's amazing to think the transformation, not just the economy of Miami, but just the country was booming, with all the technology and travel and what have you.
Yeah.
So I think Mother Nature might have said, "Hey, slow down." I'm not sure what the message is here.
Too much growth. I don't know. If you're just tuning in, by the way, hi, we are here live with Dr. George from History Miami. I'm Caroline Klibanoff with Made by Us. And if you want more context on everything that's happening today, everything has a history. So that's why we're asking a historian about it. So you can add your questions in the comments. We will get to them as we go. We'll be here till 4 o'clock Eastern time. And just a reminder, if you haven't shared your vision for the country's future, we are asking everyone to contribute their wish at mywishforus.com. And it's just a great way to start thinking about how does the past influence the present and what kind of future do we want to build together. So we're going to continue talking about pandemics. We're talking about public health, the economy, and all things Florida. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. So speaking of the tourism industry and the economy, I feel like surely the Florida tourism industry has faced travel restrictions or business closures before, maybe not even due to a pandemic, but a hurricane or other disasters. I mean, what has anything happened of this scale for this long?
Caroline, nothing of this scale. And we've had crises, obviously, when you're talking about the number one industry in the state, and it's especially significant in Southeast Florida. And anything that disrupts that, has a tremendous impact across the job market and the revenue market. We had the slaying of several tourists in the mid-90s that impacted tourism. And I remember I was privy to some of the meetings of the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau, and they were very calm, but very methodical. Wanted to get out the word that that was an aberration. It is safe, and fortunately, things came back to normal, so to speak. So I saw that, as kind of a plus. We had a sharp downturn after the attacks of 9/11. Many events were canceled down here. Even I was impacted by some tours and talks that I was going to be conducting. People decided to cancel. We weren't sure what was going on in the aftermath of that. So we've seen different blips, but nothing of this magnitude. We're now in our 5th full month of this. And when the cruise ship thing is shut down, and when the airline industry is flying at 10% capacity in some cases. It has a tremendous impact. We've never seen anything like this in terms of tourism in greater Miami and other parts of Florida.
How much is that, the result of all these compounding factors? I was amazed. I was so equal parts terrified and a little bit excited to as from being a historian, to be in Miami at a time when there's a global pandemic, and then there was just a hurricane that actually missed Miami last week, but we didn't know it would
Right.
miss us. And I felt like I was back in the Girl Scouts, like I had my pandemic badge, gonna get my hurricane badge. Badges no one wants, by the way. Um,
Yes.
so, a skill set I really don't want to keep getting better at. Um, how we had, and now there's obviously civil unrest, people confronting racism more so than we have in the past couple years. So I'm wondering, what have we seen a year like this before
Uh,
in Florida?
this is the proverbial perfect storm, as I see it. And it's not just the hurricane we just narrowly avoided, but it's projection, which is not reality, the projection of many, many more hurricanes and the projection that they may be very intense. And see, right now, we're a little bit early for the hurricane season. Its intensity begins somewhere, I'd say the third week of August, all the way through September. So we've got a ways to go when you're going to have potentially the most serious and damaging hurricanes. I've never seen anything like this. And you mentioned the Black Lives Matter thing. We've had a lot of demonstrations, and it's carried over to some of the statues we've had in greater Miami. So it's just been a time full of controversy, but history does give me solace. I'm sure it gives you solace. When I look at the broad picture of American history, we're a democracy, and we're crazy at times, and that's the nature of democracy. When you can demonstrate, you can vent your viewpoints, you can get kind of crazy,
Mhm.
and we've always not just survived, but we've come back, and we've come back. And I still think, despite gridlock in Washington and other problems there, that we're still a pretty healthy democracy as long as you had that First Amendment, among other things. I
Right.
think we're still pretty healthy, and I think we'll get through this. Again, history can be a great source of solace in
I
every
love that. I
way.
mean, that's why I like to ask historians what they think, because in a way you've seen it all. You don't have to have lived all of these centuries. If you study them, then there's patterns and
Yes.
there's progress. One of our viewers asked, looking back at history, how will the economy bounce back? I mean, is that a place where you take solace as well?
Well, it's interesting. I think that we're going to be contracted as an economy for a good long time, unfortunately. We know that, and this is something that's common knowledge, we already lost a lot of mom and pops, but we're also seeing, some of the major retailers shutting down, in part because of loss of business and all, and the debt that they're carrying. I think there's going to be a long road back for the economy. Even though we have the most dynamic economy in the world, we don't know how much longer this is going to play out.
Yeah.
And, we're hopeful of a vaccine. I am enheartened by the fact that, just empirically speaking, I'm seeing more and more people embracing masks, thank God,
Right.
things of that nature. And we have seen a dip, as you've indicated, the last, I think, 4 days in Florida, which has really been hit with
Yeah.
this raging thing. So I think we're going to have a contracted economy. It's going to be a long road back. I'm just absolutely amazed at the stock market. And they're always looking, as anybody will tell you, dealing with that, they're looking 6 months ahead.
Sure.
So they're anticipating probably the Congress getting through some kind of a stimulus payment project, as well as, 6 months down the road, maybe having a vaccine available.
Right.
But I've been amazed in many ways that, our markets have been as resilient as they've been. But we've got a long way back.
Yeah. So when we think about history, I mean, it's interesting to think about a contracted economy, because I think there may have been times in the past that were, crazy like this or difficult, that resulted in a new economy. And you have to get through that
Yes.
difficulty. But are there
Yes.
times, that you can think of that now we have, the Industrial Revolution, for example, or
Right.
to Florida,
Well,
maybe?
that's interesting because, there's been so many great articles written on this already. And I read the New Yorker as well as the New York Times. And those are two great guides, as everybody knows. New Yorker articles have indicated by one of the writers, Lawrence Wright, that at the end of the Black Plague, and he looks at it in three phases, going back to Justinian's Constantinople in the 6th century, ending on the dawn of the Renaissance. And he really believes there were new ways of thinking that came out of that prolonged Black Plague, bubonic plague, new ways of thinking that helped spawn the Renaissance. And then the argument is that coming out of the 1918 pandemic, we begin to see a real hard push, the final push for women's suffrage. And it does lead way to a cultural revolution in the 20s that some people might say was bad, and other people might say gave us more freedom. You know, women had more freedoms,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. And the technology thing is very important. We had a lot of new technology that we see in the 1920s, whether it was the talkies or commercial radio or the pervasive automobile becoming more pervasive. A lot of stuff happened in the 20s. And then there's the good side of even today. There's less smog in LA, at least there was in the early months of the pandemic. And you know, you're beginning to see improvements in many different places. So, you know, like you, I like to look at the positive side of things. And believe me, you got to push hard to look at it because we've never experienced this. In my long life, I've never experienced anything like this.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, we're living in this time where every day seems so long and so new, full of new information. I was thinking about the civil rights movement, for example, is something we talk about as just the civil rights movement. For people of my generation, we just think that was then, it was the 50s and 60s, and it happened. But if you're living through that, if you're part of it, I mean, 1955 alone is a whole bunch of stuff in there. And as we're going through
Yes,
this pandemic, it's only, in some ways, it's only been 5 months. You know, if you think
right.
about the major shifts that you're saying could come out of this, the ways things have shifted in the past. So when we're that, it's easy to look at the macro level, like these big narratives, but have you come across any stories of individuals or letters or like people who talked about the day to day living through a really difficult time, whether it's a pandemic or a war or any of that? I mean, what does that tell you?
Well, and I have Petrarch, the Renaissance figure, some people writing about in Miami, the 1918 thing. We consulted some of those records there. And in the case of, say, the impending Renaissance, I think that Petrarch, looking ahead, saw better times coming as a result of this. In the 1918 pandemic, looking at it at the micro level, the Miami level, people were very bewildered, but it was so brief. See, they were blessed in that respect, but they didn't know, they could barely understand when the beginning was. They had no idea when the end was coming. Fortunately for them, the end came very quickly. We still don't know. But you know, we've never seen technology in America the way it is today. And you can just look at the Silicon Valley, but you can look at everywhere. You can look at New York City, you can look at parts of Miami. The technology that continues to unravel is just unbelievable. And so I have a lot of confidence in the future of this country in large measure because of that. I just want to see, like a lot of us, a more just place
Sure.
than what we've seen in terms of groups that maybe haven't been in the center, they're on the periphery. I'd like to see more input in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that brings up the CEO of History Miami, George Zamanillo, has also submitted his wish for the future of the country. And he wished for a museum that strives to feature all the voices in our community and provides spaces for them to see their stories represented. So, just a reminder, if you're watching and you want to share your vision, you can go to mywishforus.com and do that. And it's just really important to think about as we're looking at history, it's not just about the big narrative pieces that you put together. I mean, each life matters. We're living through history right now, and so many institutions have been collecting COVID-19 stories and diaries and documenting what's happening because we know now this is important. And if we could look back at 1918 and see, you know, so many voices, so many diary entries, so many stories that could give us clues to how to navigate today. So is that something you've seen happening? I don't know if History Miami is collecting, but
Well, we are. We're very interesting. One of the earlier CEOs said that we're the community's attic. That, you know, you bring all your stuff and you put them upstairs in your attic area, and we've been doing that. And also, we have some wonderful artifacts, written artifacts, like a health department book about the deaths, and we have some funeral books about the deaths in 1918.
wow.
And you know, the time of the death, obviously the name, the cause, usually the cause was pneumonia as a result of this influenza of that particular year. And we have a lot of photographs of people who were victims. We have photographs of the hospital, which was at that time called the city hospital, and even a photograph of the tents around it because they didn't have enough room in there to take care of all the people, which is similar to what happened, say, in New York in March and April when they had the huge crisis up there. So we have both wonderful artifacts of 1918 pandemic, and we're gathering things today. The museum is not only very historical, the museum is very current, and we've been
Yeah.
able to benefit. Lots of exhibitions too.
I
Yeah.
I would encourage all of our viewers, if you're watching, when you can visit again, when you can visit Miami again and visit the museum, to check out History Miami, because there are incredible exhibits. There's so many interactive parts. I love there's a board that says what makes Miami Miami, and you can tell your story, draw a picture, use a word to describe it. And I think, and you all have this amazing Miami Stories archive of people's lives who have, everyone has their own Miami story. I've only been in and out of Miami for a year, and I would like to say that I, in some small way, feel I have a Miami story too. It is such a confluence of cultures and people and just different influences coming together that really make it such a unique place.
Well, it is in Caroline. People using it for research, our research center. It's absolutely amazing the archival assets we have. We've got over 1 million images, for example, that pertain to Miami going back to the 19th century. And then people coming to visit the museum, look at the exhibition. The exhibitions are absolutely unbelievable. Every quarter, and we've got folk life element there. I mean, we got everything going there. It's a very interesting place. I like to go there sort of in my anonymous hat and kind of walk around at an exhibition after it's up, and maybe on a weekday when there might not be a ton of people there, and just kind of go through it very carefully and methodically. But the variety of things that we have exhibited, especially in recent years, have been phenomenal.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, and actually brings to mind yet another question I have about the 1918 pandemic and previous pandemics. When people had to isolate themselves, you don't get that same mix of cultures. You don't get that same,
Yes.
interaction between people. Now maybe it's different because of the internet, but was that something people ever talked about or that you've come across from the past?
Well, they haven't, but it's made me think about it, and it's made you think about it, because again, this greater Miami area is really built on this coming together of so many different people. And as you and I talked earlier today, many of them starting over again for different reasons, whether they're coming from the Caribbean or Latin America, or coming from the Northeast United States, or wherever. This is a place to begin again, to get back on your feet, if that's the case that brought you here. And those, for example, the quarantine city of 1899, 1900 was very brief. It was 3 months. And you didn't have anybody coming in or out, at least legally. And it was really too brief of a time, I think, to impact it in terms of that quarantine. In 1918, it was brief again. Essentially, people were discouraged from coming in or out for a period of about a month, and that was it. It's a little bit different this time,
Yeah,
in terms of not many people coming by plane, nobody coming by cruise ship.
right.
And there have been different communities saying, listen, if you're going to come here or there, you're coming from Miami, you got to be quarantined for 14 days. So it's even been a reverse thing for us. So we're on trod earth to some degree.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I just think of the loss that comes when you don't have that type of communication and sharing.
Well, that's what America's been like really since heavy immigration began in the 1880s, in the Gilded Age. And that's what's made us the country we are. And look at the machine politics in late 19th century America. It was Irish immigrant driven.
Mm-hmm.
Or, look at what the Italians did in terms of bringing in culture to it. Look what the
Right.
Jews did in the Lower East Side of New York and elsewhere. I mean, that's how we're defined as a nation of
Yeah.
immigrants.
Well, it's so interesting. I mean, having spent just a little time in Miami this year, I meet so many people that are from Miami, and I meet so many people that are not. I meet so many
Yeah.
people that are New Yorkers. Every third person I meet is like a New Yorker. Um, So it's been fascinating. It really is quite a mix. And actually that does remind me, and then I'll get to a question from our viewer, but we have asked people to share their favorite historic recipes just now on social media earlier today at History Made by Us, because that's one of the ways that, people can plug into history, family history, local history. Food is something we all can connect with.
Sure.
And it's something that people are experiencing anew now in quarantine because they're going back to growing food, or they're researching family recipes to try out because they're home, and you can't get as much restaurant or delivery food anymore. So we've seen a bit of a return to some of those older ways, I think. So someone has a question whether the states during the 1918 flu, were states more closely coordinated, or did Florida have such disparate regulations? Did states have disparate regulations the way we see today, where they're kind of doing their own thing?
It really varied from state to state, as today, and those regulations were really driven by the large cities, if they had any, in the states. San Francisco, in many ways, drove that whole California mindset. New York obviously drove the New York State mindset, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it was so different. For example, we think we were wiser in Miami because once we took this seriously in that first to second week of October, we didn't have war bond sale parades and crowds, but Philadelphia, unwisely, in the late summer, early fall, had a huge crowd of people standing along either Broad or Market Street as this war bond sale parade came through. And we believe that really fed that flu problem for Philadelphia. So it really varied once again from state to state, as it does today.
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about. I mean, clearly there's so many lessons we can take from the past, and not just what did they do then, so what do we know to do now, but just the general sense that these things take time, that there's an ebb and flow to all of history. So I appreciate that perspective. One question I had, and by the way, anyone watching, you feel free to drop in your questions into the comments, and we will get to them. We have about 15 more minutes. But I wanted to know if there were any impacts on the environment. And maybe that's a crazy question because, as you said, the Florida population really boomed much later than
Right.
than 1918.
Right.
But has that been affected by things like human disease?
Well, I don't see much of an impact in 1918 on the environment. I will tell you why a wonderful coincidence that people in Miami, throughout Florida and elsewhere, were growing victory gardens, and
Yeah.
those victory gardens helped those families. In other words, victory gardens were set up so that you could, when you harvested your vegetables and maybe fruits, you would then send them off to some sort of a central repository to help feed the men in uniform at the time.
Mhm.
But now victory gardens became really an assistance to families in October of 1918, those who might be hard pressed because they weren't at work. So that really helped them a lot. You didn't have the pollution we have today, but we're already seeing today, getting back to that whole LA theme, or different parts of the world, we see remarkable changes in the environment very quickly as more people were sheltering and, were within their own confines, weren't out there to spoiling the environment. So I'm not aware of too much of the influence on the environment at that time. And
Sure.
again, we were an interesting mix of people in Miami-Dade County. It's a vast county in terms of size,
Mhm.
stretching from Aventura, Northeast Dade, down to Florida City. It's got to be at least 60 or 70 miles
Wow.
in length. But what we had was we still had a big farm belt in different parts of the community. And you had people in many ways who were actually working farms, and I don't think they were impaired in terms of work because of the nature of their job, as opposed to people who might be working in factories or a retail store in downtown Miami that did suffer for a while from that. But again, it was merciful, Caroline, in that it was very brief, whatever sorts of quarantining measures or shutdown measures that we had.
Right. Yeah, that makes a huge difference. And I guess the sharing of information would have been very different as well.
Well, that's an interesting point. Today, obviously, we've got 24-hour news feeds and the internet and everything else we got going. So it's just instant information, constant information. Then it was a lot different. Newspapers, the health departments would put out reports, but they were really only promulgated by word of mouth or by posting something in different parts of town or carried in newspapers.
Mhm.
So news moved, relatively speaking, very slowly. We didn't have commercial radio then either. Obviously, we didn't have TV then. And a minority of people drove automobiles. So getting the news out was much slower. But, word of mouth was important. And again, we were more compact as a community. So if you knew what was happening to the hospital then is where the hospital is today, the main hospital, Jackson Memorial Hospital. That's about 3+ miles from where I'm at. It was a very compact city, so word could spread easier by mouth then. It wasn't as sprawling. Yet, even in the outlying areas, you had a lot of victims of this. And we have information on doctors that treated a lot of these victims of the spread.
Wow.
Incidentally, just as an aside, the school thing's a big thing. I have a daughter trucking off to Florida State as a freshman, and she
Oh,
has to take all the courses online, but she still wants the university experience. were very supportive of it. I went to school there. My two sons went to school there. So we'll be taking her up in a week or so. But what's interesting is that she'll be online, which may be a good idea, even though it's going to really constrain, her socializing, what have you. The University of Florida, which was the major men's university during the epidemic of 1918, 1/3 of the student body was stricken with this pandemic influenza, as was the president of the university. So, the issue of schools is a big issue. And you can see that it didn't bode very well in those days. Maybe the
Wow.
idea of shutting the schools as they did in October might have been good, because we never really had a resurgence
Right.
after the month of October was over.
That's very interesting. I mean, there's definitely lessons we can look to history for there. We just did a post on social media for Made by Us about outdoor schools that were tried in Rhode Island. Which is a
Yes.
little harder to do outdoor school there, weather-wise, than in Miami.
Yes.
Although I don't know, those Miami thunderstorms every day. Um,
Scary.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think the schools question comes up a lot, people looking to history for answers there. And actually, we have a really great question from Maureen watching on Facebook. This is probably something we could talk for much longer about than we have time for. How much time has to pass before something becomes history? And in terms of telling history in schools, who gets to decide, what's history and what perspectives to leave out? I mean,
Well,
there's
that's
a
been
lot to unpack there.
that's an age-old question, and the old cliche that the victors write the history. I don't know if that pertains to much, but that's a great question. And that's incidentally a question that's being bandied about today. I saw a candidate for office in Illinois. It was on YouTube or something, Democrat, and he's saying we need to get rid of all of our history books and rewrite them all. He's an African American, saying it really has been so slanted over the years and centuries and what have you. So that question has come up again and again and again. But I want to address the first part of the question, and that is, when does something become history?
Yeah.
We're in these, again, 24-hour news cycles, and you can read something in the morning online, and suddenly in the afternoon there's a completely different story about that. So history today is being challenged by how quickly we're looking at news and then moving on to another topic, not even digesting it. I think history becomes history today much more rapidly than it did once upon a time, because of the accessibility of stories and news than it did before. I look back at Watergate, and that was 46 years ago. Well, that's almost like ancient history.
Yeah.
But if you look at what's happened since that time, there have been so many things that relate from that period till today.
Yeah.
So I think history starts a lot earlier now than it did once upon a time. Exactly when, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But in some cases, we're so jammed with news that I look at something 3 years ago almost as ancient history now.
I mean, I hear you, because when this pandemic hit, history museums got to work. As I said, they started collecting these stories. We knew immediately we were living through history. It's very weird to know that as it's happening. I don't know how much people in 1918 were thinking, got to record this for the history books. I'm sure some were. But it does seem like we're able to recognize that. And one thing we try to do through Made by Us is say, to Maureen's second question, you're a part of the story. Everyone's voice matters. History is not just the big wars and the big moments, but it's also your grandmother's pie recipe, or it's your community and how your community came to sustain itself and the cultural heartbeat that lives there. So we're trying to find ways to shore up the individual stories, and History Miami does a fantastic job of that. So it's definitely to your credit. And once again, I'll remind our viewers, when we're able to travel again, if you go to Miami, definitely check out History Miami's exhibits. And even now online, you can watch videos of Miami stories. You can listen to people talk about their experience. It's really a remarkable archive that you have there.
We appreciate it. Our website will keep them up on everything. I teach classes via Zoom in Miami, South Florida history and Florida history. We sometimes do virtual tours, lots of talks on different topics I've been doing since March and April. So we've been able to adapt to this platform and reach a lot of people. And when things return to some degree of normality, when we're not sure, I'll be conducting tours again, boat, walk, train, bus, you name everything but airplanes. So we'd love to have people come out on that. But getting back to what you said, we collect everything from grandmom's pie recipe to a photograph of a particular event in Miami, to different artifacts. We had, for example, we hosted the Super Bowl in Miami this past February.
Yeah.
We had a tremendous NFL exhibition on the history of the National Football League over a period of 100 years. We hosted that, and you should have seen some of the artifacts that were brought into the museum from there. Plus, we had our own Miami Dolphin players and coaches going back to this earlier era who were there for opening night. So, yeah, history is a very broad thing, and again, we collect a wide array of artifacts and images.
Fantastic. Well, we're so glad to be able to ask you our questions. Dr. George of History Miami does do so many classes and sessions. And last night I saw there was a, what's the name? Sip of History? Is that what it's called?
Yes, we did that a couple nights ago. And we had a wonderful guy who had been a student of mine, a mixologist, who mixed up an old fashioned, and it was almost like it was a sort of a Cuban touch to it. And I'm telling you, that old fashioned was great. It was really good.
There's a history element. It's very old fashioned. I love it. So we're so glad, we're so glad to have this chance to have a conversation with you. And thanks to all of our viewers for tuning in. I will just make a couple of reminders for our viewers. One is we have a way, you've made your wish on My Wish for Us. That's great. And you can see a wish from Dr. George and others from History Miami there. You can also see historical wishes from figures in the past, which is really neat. But after you make your wish, we're offering these workshops where you can come learn new tools to turn your wish into action. So we have some really neat tools to go back to the future. We have some tools to help find others in your ecosystem who, want the same things that you do. You can find out about that at historymadebyus.org. And there you can also sign up for our newsletters, which is really great. And for History Miami, their website is historymiami.org. If you're watching this on their page, you already follow them on Facebook, but check out their other social media. And if you have thoughts about things you want to hear from us, more questions for Dr. George we didn't get to, things that Made by Us could do for you, leave a comment. We will get back to you. And then the last thing I'll say is Made by Us is this coalition of so many museums coming together. We want to find new ways to reach and engage young people in history, because history is really that first building block of civic engagement. So I just wanted to give a shout out to our other Florida-based partners. We have quite a few. Florida Humanities is a partner, the Tallahassee Museum, Tampa Bay History Center, Kids Citizen has a Florida base as well. So if you know other museums, institutions, archives that should be a part of what we're doing and benefit from these programs that we want to produce and find avenues and new places for history, just put them in touch with us. We're arms are open, doors are open, metaphorically and virtually, not in person. And be sure to tune in to future events that we have. So Dr. George, any closing thoughts for our viewers out there?
Well, I'm just so happy we could do this. And I'm so happy that History Miami is tied in with programs of this nature. This has been fantastic, Caroline. I've really enjoyed it a lot. And in just preparing for this, I've learned an awful lot about plagues going back to Athens beginning in 431 BC, which wrecked the city. 1/3 of the population expired as a result of that plague. So it's been a great learning experience for me too. And I welcome the opportunity. We'd like to have our viewers just come visit us at History Miami or take advantage of some of the things we have online too.
Go visit. History Miami is one of the founding partners of Made by Us. They're driving this effort forward. And yeah, like Dr. George said, there's always more to learn. If he has more to learn in preparing for this, then there's more to learn for all of us. So we're looking forward to exploring more about the past.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.